Good evening. Welcome to LRB Screen at Home. My name is Gareth Evans. I'm your host for the evening, and the kind of intention of the evening is in the title, Screen at Home. Not difficult to understand, of course, 3 words, at home being perhaps the most operative. Obviously, some of us in the UK are not quite understanding what that term means. We were thinking of coming remotely this evening from Barnard Castle or from the other end of the country. We're in the south of the country at the moment, but we decided against it following obviously nationally approved guidelines. Wherever you might be, we're delighted to welcome you, whether in the UK, of course, or globally. A wonderful LRB audience drawn from across the planet. Thank you very much indeed, wherever you are, for coming and spending an hour with us this Wednesday evening, UK time, British summer time here. I've got the fever. That is, of course, a direct reference to Peggy Lee, who was 100 yesterday. She would have been 100. She's immortal, of course, in our hearts, but I have got the fever, a little bit of hay fever. So if there is a little bit of disturbance on the line, that is exactly what is the cause of it. I'm using Olbas oil to alleviate the symptoms of that. It's not advised for internal ingestion, unless you're, of course, in the United States, where you can take anything internally, and it will, of course, work wonders for all health conditions. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Do remember, if you have been with us before, that you can join in the conversation directly through the comments option on the YouTube channel page for this event. If you haven't been with us, then please do take advantage of that. Constructive and engaged and witty comments, always welcome, of course, and questions directly to our 2 wonderful guests this evening, Hugo Glendinning and Adrian Heathfield. Welcome to you both.
Hello. Hi, Gareth.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Wonderful makers of this extraordinary film we've had the privilege and the pleasure to see. Thank you very much indeed for making it available to us. We're going to go straight into a conversation now about Transfigured Night and then place it, I think, in the larger context of your ongoing work together. So perhaps, Adrian, we could start with you. Alphonso Lingis, an incredible writer, an incredible philosopher, an embodied presence in the world. You were drawn very much to his writing, and you and Hugo decided to visit him and film a conversation over a couple of days with him. A performance dialogue. We'll come on to the idea of the title a little bit later on, the kind of framework for this. But you set up the film very strikingly at moments of crisis, if you like. There's meteorological crisis, there's election turbulence, shall we say, potentially, on the horizon. And so it feels both in that sense of kind of an establishing shot, but very relevant to where we are now, but of course also very striking in how we are not able to meet in the current climate, which is, of course, partly why we wanted to show the film. So if you could just let us know a little bit about how you came to Alphonso Lingis's writing, and of course then the further encounter actually in person.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd been reading Al for quite a long time. I write on contemporary performance, experimental theatre, dance, and obviously being a performance scholar, I have a kind of an interest and kind of heritage in anthropological writing, and Al's philosophical work obviously has a strong kind of connection to that field of thought. So Al had always really been in my framework of reading, but one of my favorite writers. And I was actually introduced to him, invited into a panel by the brilliant theatre scholar Alan Reed. And so we had a kind of formal exchange, and that in a sense became the pretext for me to write to him and say, can we visit you? But I guess deeper than that, it came from a kind of set of practices that wrapped up with Hugo in any case, which is a set of practices around dialogue itself. So we were trying to think about a form of filmmaking that was a dialogue that simply was ordered around exchange. And Hugo and I, of course, have had a dialogue for a long time. It started really around Hugo's images, because Hugo is, one of the foremost documenters and photographers of contemporary performance, experimental theatre, dance, portraiture, artists. And so Hugo had kind of been in my sights for a long time, and we made a book together which was laced with Hugo's photographs of performances, and that really started our creative dialogue off, and then led to other forms of collaboration. So we started to make together after the book some performance lectures that were moving between more discursive articulation and the presence of images, and sometimes even short clips of films that Hugo had made. And so we started to get this, I guess, this little buzz about the relationship between language, thought, discursive articulation, dialogue, and its relationship to image. And so that, I guess, is the kind of a little bit kind of heritage of the film.
Well, that's a tremendous introduction, and thank you very much indeed for doing my job for me, introducing both yourself and Hugo so eloquently. I would expect nothing less, of course. At some point, if there is a technical glitch, a red question mark appears. It's very likely be on my screen, and it will, of course, raise the larger question of whether I'm actually in any way necessary to this dialogue undertaking, because Hugo and Adrian clearly are not only supremely articulate, but also very able to hold the screen. So let's see what happens with that red question mark if it appears. And we will think of it perhaps as a larger existential question, which might or might not be answered by any of us. But many thanks indeed, Adrian, for setting that up for us. That's a tremendous kind of pitch to us about how the project came about. Now, Hugo, you look like you're in your studio. Is that right?
Yeah, I am. Only the second time I've been in my studio in the last 2.5 months, but yeah, I'm here.
That would be because your studio is in Durham, isn't it? And so
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've got my kids are behind the curtain over there, and I'm going to keep them there isolated.
Very good, very good. Well, thank you for sharing your studio space with us, obviously remotely this evening. And given what Adrian said about your kind of developing collaboration, which has led to this series and much else besides, when you were presented with Al Lingis's house, which of course is an extraordinary part, a kind of extra character in the film, should we say? What was your first sense? Because you had 2 days, but you didn't have so long to establish yourself, and you needed to kind of hit the ground running. What was your sort of initial sense of how this encounter might be filmed?
Well, I actually had no idea how we were going to do it. I mean, I can tell you in a very brief way that generally we don't try and clear up or make any great intervention in the space. We just try and show people with their mugs and coffee makers and kettles and whatever else lying around. There's never a great reshuffle of space in order to make things easier for ourselves. We like to work within the existing layout of rooms and whatever. So, I mean, one thing was for sure, we weren't going to shove everything around and make a clean space to shoot in. But having said that, it does mean that I was frequently jammed up against windows, getting unbelievably uncomfortable. But those are just the physical necessities of space. We were also presented with a warren of different types of usage that Al has in his house. He has a huge aviary, which seems to be inside his house. You don't really know. There's a little journey in the film down a corridor, and you end up in the aviary, which is a huge space full of birds, his birds. And then, we slept there. We stayed with Al in every sense. And our bedrooms were also full of extraordinary things. I mean, I think my bedroom was a kind of shrine to sort of sexual iconography of some sort. I had one character with a massive penis and all sorts of other sort of fertility symbols. I mean, it was quite a place to sleep when you hadn't really prepared for it. So, it was an extraordinary place to visit with the kind of collection, the sort of breadth of collecting that only somebody as extraordinary as Al Lingis could put together.
Fantastic. I mean, that sense of the property, the surprise of it, obviously for both of you, but also for us, the viewer, is palpable. Now, Adrian, I mean, you talk very beautifully at the beginning when you're setting up the film for us about this idea of meeting, the writer, the thinker, in person after a longer engagement, obviously on the page, and clearly. Alphonso Lingis is extremely generous. He's very genial, very welcoming, as you both already intimated. But he's also someone who draws his philosophy, his way of thinking and being in the world, very much from the world, from constant exchange, whether linguistically, geographically, across disciplines and so on. And so now, thinking about the film from where we are now, I mean, it becomes a real a time capsule of both another world that might or might not be possible exactly again in the future, but also of a kind of a utopian proposal. Do you think of it like that? Is that a useful way of thinking about this kind of work?
Yeah, I don't know whether that would be a kind of way that Al would frame his way of being in the world. And of course, the kind of itinerancy that he's engaged in, and I guess we were pretty lucky to catch him at home since he seems to be almost constantly on the move, it's not really an easy itinerancy. I mean, it's not a kind of light tourist engagement with exotic sites of alterity. He's someone who spends time in communities and also seeks out places and sites of difficulty and intensity. And you know, some of that is kind of reflected in the film. I should also say, actually, part of the thing that Hugo is talking about this the moment of entering the space and discovering the space and just having to be in it, it's part also really of the ethos of all of the dialogue films, which is trying to work in this kind of ad hoc way with the event of encounter with another person and the event of exchange, to see, in a sense, if you can attune yourself to the thoughts of another and see what arises in that kind of conversational moment. And Al was, in a way, a kind of ideal subject for that, as you mentioned, because of his just prodigious generosity and openness. But there are some strange trajectories in the film because, you know, there's the trajectory of jet lag. I noticed this. It was really lovely to watch it again. I haven't seen it for a long time, but I can recognize the way we somehow, we come down to earth and we sort of also wake up a little bit over those 2 days. And it also relaxes a little bit over the 2 days. So you see at the beginning, the exchange is quite formal. It's more like some of the other interview films we've done that are a bit more intensely discursive at the beginning, and then it becomes looser and more conversational. And Hugo somehow seemed to feel that, and there's a lot more work with sort of moving in and out of focus as the film progresses, and it becomes more a kind of open, improvised conversation.
Yeah. I mean, if I could add something to that,
please.
The state we were in, because you know, we did fly in and start working straight away. So the very first shots in his car, we're listening to the radio, we're trying to figure out what way the election's going, things like that. But that evening, we settled down to watch the Herzog film, Wadabi, Herdsman of the Sun, all together in a state of real abject tiredness. And we're all sat on Al's bed watching this film. And it's a film which has the herdsman doing a sort of fertility. It's a dance of where sexual partners are going to be made. And there are all these flashing eyes, extraordinary faces. And at the same time, we're sitting on Al's bed, trying to keep our eyes awake, doing exactly the same things these herdsmen are doing. And that kind of moment gives us it gave us a moment of bonding, if you like. I mean, bonding's totally the wrong word because, you know, there was no purpose in it. But it's a sharing of something. It's a sharing of tiredness. It's a sharing of space. It's a sharing of the ideas in the film that really kind of put us in a place to do everything else. It was quite extraordinary.
Tremendous. I mean, that idea of the kind of immersive encounter that you've both described so well is clearly central to how we kind of experience it, you know, sonically and visually. I mean, given your description of the spare room, clearly, then the herdsman screening will take on a whole other charge, I guess, as well. Yeah. And there's obviously a few faces looking at you from the wall, with wide open eyes, to say the least. This encounter with the other is central to what we're doing here. Of course, the LRB Screen at Home initiative. Many thanks indeed to the London Review of Books and to the London Review Bookshop for making it possible, and tonight for bringing us to you. Many thanks indeed to Sam and Anthony, who are behind the scenes as ever, pulling the strings so that nothing goes wrong. And if it does go wrong, of course, they will have left the room by that stage and leave us literally hanging, like so many government ministers before us. So we're really delighted and pleased here now to bring in the first comment from another who's incredibly welcome here tonight, Kate Gower. She sent in a comment, a question, a very lucid and insightful observation about the film, which I'd like to put, if I could, to you, Adrian, before we go to our first clip. She says, Transfigured Night basks in the texture of non-linear thought, anchored with an unwavering gaze by the static backdrop of Alphonso Lingis's decontextualized artifacts and the silence of thinking. The film offers the viewer a beautiful anthropological encounter with Lingis, using the exchange of document as a stimulus for thought. Was this an intentional way to ground the film and to give weight and identity to the meeting?
Yeah, that's wow. I'm so glad you're recording the comments, because that will obviously make its way into some kind of press release at some point. But yeah, no, I don't think there is. I mean, obviously, it's partly intentional in a certain way, in that the film is produced from certain sensibilities that have an orientation towards a more poetic, non-linear, non-narrative approach to a documentary. But actually, I think the real answer to it is that it arises from the gift of Al. I mean, in a sense, the moment that Hugo is describing, when we're in this kind of reverential, mesmeric, jet-lagged, semi-sleep, trying to attend to something that Al thinks is important for us to see. That when he's doing that, he's also saying, maybe this is an important artifact for you to understand how I think, or my relation to the world, or even my tastes and joys. And so, in a way, what happened is that methodology then became the methodology of exchange. So we ended up, I had brought along with me a whole bunch of bits of documentation of performances, because in a way, part of my interest in these films was to expand and elaborate kind of set of thoughts around my own investments and practices in performance. And this was in the days of DVDs, so I sort of schlepped along with a gathering of about 10 different bits of archival stuff. And so in a way, this kind of exchange of archival materials became the improvised mode of relation, and it enabled us to sort of enter a space of looser associative exchange that wasn't so much like an interview, but was more like co-thinking artifacts together. And Al had also already started that, because as soon as we arrived, he was showing us things from his travels and his world. And one of the extraordinary things about that is that every single thing in that place, an amazing, beautiful house, has a story attached to it, and also a set of thoughts and realizations about the nature of things, or the nature of exchange, or the nature of the world. So in a way, it was a kind of improvised modality that arose in relation, but it's deep in Al's practice as a thinker. There's one point in the film where he says that thinking is thanking, and he has this framework around his writing, which is a kind of practice of gratitude to and for the world. And so I think that I'd say that's probably mostly where that sensibility comes from. But it's a little bit a shared sensibility. I mean, it's in Hugo's sensibility as a photographer and videographer and cinematographer, in the sense that, you know, one of the things I really admire about what Hugo does is this kind of a brilliant quality of attunement to the event. You know, he's spent so many years being in performances, waiting for the right moment to take the image, or to form a presence that is so lightly able to transform the event into something else. So I think it's a kind of mixing of sensibilities, really.
Well, that's tremendous, and that leads brilliantly into, I think, our first clip, and also what I'd like to speak with you afterwards about, Hugo, about that idea of presence and capturing presence, both your own presence in the room, of course, and how that impacts, as Adrian said, but also this tension, if you like, between certainly in Al Lingis's case, you know, the striking nature of the room, and then this idea of capturing thought. So I think, without further ado, with perhaps no introduction, let's just go into the first clip, and then we'll explain this afterwards. Thank you very much.
I'm a writer, but I relate to painters, actors, etc., and somehow I'm also one of them. But I think in all those situations of creation, of opening oneself, becoming a kind of door and space, welcoming space for the apparition or surge or coming into the world of something else or someone else. All those who belong to different practices, different languages, share, I'm absolutely sure, what I just called echoing you, actually, the precondition. We are the preconditioning beings who are without whom nothing and no one would happen.
Thank you very much. That was a clip of Hélène Sixou in conversation, and I am in conversation with curator and theorist Adrian Heathfield and filmmaker and photographer Hugo Glendinning about their wonderful film in conversation with Alphonso Lingis called Transfigured Night. You're watching LRB Screen at Home on the LRB Bookshop YouTube channel. Many thanks for joining us wherever you might be in the world, and don't forget that you can take part in this through comments, interventions, constructive responses through the YouTube channel of the bookshop. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. Now, just before that clip, Hugo, we were talking about the idea of presence, both the presence, of course, of the subject, but also your presence as a photographer and documentarian in the space of performance, and how both that impacts and redirects the nature of what you're documenting and photographing, but also how your presence can directly be in conversation, shall we say, with the subject. And I think that was the case with this film. This was the first film that you and Adrian made together in this series of encounters with philosophers, and it has quite a different feel, if you like, to the later works. Could you set this up for us and just think a little about this idea of presence and performance?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's one of the things that's concerned me all my career is, to what extent should I be in the room affecting what's happening, and to what extent should I really try and disappear? And there never has been a direct answer to that question. In fact, it's always been eliding between these two things, coming and going, but definitely not denying either one. So I think when I started moving more towards working with moving images, the question became even more urgent in many ways, because with a still camera, you can move around and give yourself all sorts of permissions to do things, and this can sometimes be destructive, or at least change the events you're a part of. Whereas with a moving camera, you really have to try and find ways of doing it that are much, much more subtle, because all the bits between are visible. So asking myself, what is it to be an active participant in these dialogues without being really annoying? And I think that was one of the huge questions. And I think I was very timid at first with Hélène. I really found any movement quite difficult to do. Not that I knew it was wrong. It was just, how do I make the movements that I want to make without destroying the moment? Because, I mean, one of the things, like the messed up rooms, or at least the not making careful sets for ourselves to let things happen, you also let things happen by doing things. I mean, it's not exclusive. So finding ways of changing both environment and the way of looking was at that point really difficult to me, and made me sweat through the whole process. It was painful. Apart from the fact that I was a complete amateur as well. And, you know, later on in one of the dialogues with Bernard Stiegler, he gave me the most wonderful excuse for being an amateur, which was to say that, you know, over-competencies of professionalism destroy art. And so I've come to adopt this position of the amateur as really, you know, the default beginning of how I should be in a room with anybody. And that is, the amateur still has to ask questions. I have to be there asking questions. Even if they're not vocalized, it has to happen with me listening, with me responding to micro movements, to be there in every way I can be, and a participant.
Well, that is tremendous, and I mean, and this idea of the amateur, of course, I mean, is something we could think about in etymological terms, because, of course, it comes from the Latin to love. You know, the same word stem is present. So this idea of a deep affection for something, and somehow that having transformed over the centuries into a position outside of professionalism is an interesting one. But if we take that idea forward, Adrian, about that kind of embodiment in the space, I mean, this film finds a very effective styling, a representation, both as a work about place, the incredible house that Lingis occupies, but also, of course, what all the series works do is engage with their particular places. We'll come on to the Stiegler clip a little bit later, as well as Brian Massumi. And you kind of, throughout all the works, think about how to capture thought in that space. And so they each find their own style, but you're constantly in negotiation with the physical space and the idea of thought unfolding in real time. So when you're thinking about how to actually speak and respond to the philosopher in question, how do you prepare and then obviously improvise in response? Because clearly there's a huge body of work at stake in each encounter.
Thinking about all of the... oh, you've lost me?
No, I did for a second, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm a little bit glitchy in real life. I think it's a really beautiful thought for thinking about the whole series, to frame them in a sense as works of love in some way, because they are actually based on a kind of adoration and intimacy for the figures within them, but it's a kind of adoration and intimacy that comes from reading, and so it's a distant intimacy. And then there is in each of the films this sudden encounter into the Ed-fleshed relation, and the sort of shock of entering that and negotiating the relationship between what you've intensively researched beforehand, because each of the exchanges is, you know, I would read everything. I would read as much as I possibly could that this author had written. And yet, of course, that's no preparation for the event of relations. So, but it gives you some armor and some possibilities, some improvisational possibilities, some vocabularies, some points of entry. But actually, I think I've been learning. I learned throughout the whole series, really, because they initially they're very formal, and the questions are very intense and elaborate and long. And by the end, I've pretty much given up on that methodology of over preparation. And I guess in a way that also it's also to do with the resonance of lovers, that the project is also a way of making myself a student of these thinkers. You know, so there's another kind of dimension of the amateurization there, which is to really put yourself, to subject yourself to becoming a student again, and to be in the space of reception and intensive learning in a way that perhaps isn't so easy for those of us who are sort of you know, in the profession of the professors, the ones who are supposed to know, to take positions, to outline frameworks, etc., to have incisive analyses. I mean, a lot of what I'm doing in the preparation for the relation is to try and give myself to the person's thought and to the body of work, and to see what place I come out at in the event of relation with them.
Tremendous. Well, thank you both very much indeed. I think we should have a look, another clip now. Let's go straight into a short extract from the film with Brian Massumi. Thank you very much.
Like a lot of people, I have to get up and move. I tend to pace and do something very rhythmic. But it's often when I'm in movement and not specifically thinking about what I'm writing that the ideas come. One example that I often think about was just a small event many years ago when I was a child, was being in a car and a van speeding past too fast, swerving and then rolling over. There's a kind of untimeliness to an event like that. It happens so quickly, you're in a state of shock, you're bracing for what's happening without cognizing it. At the same time, you know what's happening, but you couldn't put it into words. So it's a feeling, but it's a feeling that's already thinking this event, what it is. Not just recognizing it, but bracing for the absolute uniqueness, what is going to happen. So in that moment of embracing, I'm in the potential of the event, and what will retrospectively be the form of the event already seems to have a presence, so that when it comes, it's like a deja vu.
Thank you so much. That was a short clip from the feature-length performance dialogue with Brian Massumi, conducted by our wonderful guests this evening, Adrian and Hugo. More very shortly on that, but you are watching the LRB Screen at Home initiative, and my conversation this evening around the film with Alphonso Lingis that Hugo and Adrian made, called Transfigured Night. We're also looking at the range of their work, and just before that clip, Adrian mentioned the idea of staying in the kind of mode of being a student, of really engaging properly with the work of the philosophers in question. And it seems a perfect moment to remind you, of course, that the London Review of Books has the bookshop, which of course is hosting this event. And at that bookshop, of course, will reside many titles by the wonderful philosophers that we are talking about. So please do support, of course, the London Review Bookshop and your own local bookshop, wherever you might find yourself, and keep these vital outposts of independent thought and culture alive through this very difficult period. I would like to draw your attention also at this point to a very special subscription offer that the LRB are offering, but we will come on to that towards the end of the programme, which will be in about half an hour's time. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Now, Hugo, in the previous clips, we've been inside. We've been very much inside with Alphonso Lingis and also with Ellen Sixou. And here with Brian Massumi, perhaps indicated by the title of the film that you've made, No Such Thing as Rest, Brian is ready to get out, and he gets out into the street. And you obviously have to follow and keep up. And it changes the nature of the rhythm of filming, of course, very much. It changes the nature of kind of capturing that thought, but you're very much in action with Adrian and Brian. And so once that happened, how did you think about what that meant for kind of conveying these this rich content?
Well, I think as a strategy for making a film about a dialogue, about speaking and about thinking, it stems from something I've done for many years, particularly with Tim Etchell's and Forced Entertainment, which is trying to find ways of seeing people thinking, seeing the thought happen. And I mean, in a way, this comes back to the idea of the amateur, and that overdeveloped professional competencies actually are a mask to real thought. The acting, if you like, if we're talking about the work I've done with Forced Entertainment, needs to be visible. You need to keep the performer there in a state where you can see and think, otherwise it's not interesting. So I think with Brian, the walk does actually strategically do that. It means that rather than expounding, you get something that is much closer to real thinking coming out, that it's happening now, just as the walking is happening out, because the body is distracting you. So as far as what the dialogue is itself, this is entirely controlled by Adrian and Brian, but the fact that they're moving and the fact that we're also as an audience, quite distracted by other stuff that's going on, gives it a different kind of immediacy. Things are happening now, and I think this is a real strength. I mean, having said that, I would say that that particular film did tax my own competencies maybe a bit too far. There were some bad decisions made, but at the same time, the purpose was totally right.
Tremendous. I mean, it's interesting when you say bad decisions, because of course in the process of being alive, we make certain choices which might or might not in the moment kind of feel like the right ones, but of course the larger accumulation of experience might cast them in a very different light. And so in that sense, Adrian, I mean, as you're literally thinking, on the hoof as it were, walking with Brian, inevitably that external stimulation is kind of coming into the mix and changing the conversation very much in real time. And with Brian Massumi, was that something that was always sort of intentional and kind of inevitable in his work, or something that you kind of welcomed at that moment?
Well, the Massumi dialogue was really the last one in the series, and Brian had actually seen the other films, or at least some of the other films. So there was an interesting dynamic developing, which is that we'd gone from a position where we were just inventing something that we had never done before, and there was no public record of it. And then we sort of entered a form, and then we had form for the subjects that we were in the sort of the last two. I think both subjects had seen other examples of the work that we had done. So in a sense, they then took more agency in relationship to the form, and that was really what was happening with Brian. And it was very much a kind of fitting dimension in relationship to the nature of his thought, because of course he's coming from that tradition of process philosophy, and so everything is about temporality and flow and transformation and change. He also was quite clear that he didn't really want to be a filmed subject in quite the same way, a talking head, as it were.
Yeah.
And that for him, he was more interested in a kind of a more dissipated, environmental, project that would have movement at its heart, but also would not be so focused on the sort of the subject that thinks and that elaborates and spews forth for us his thoughts. And so that in a way that's also led to Hugo inventing this crazy contraption where, you know, he had two cameras tied together because we're really not, we've never been in the mode of redoing anything particularly or restaging anything. We either get it in the moment or we don't. And so in a sense, you know, what Hugo was doing was making two cameras that point in opposite directions so that he would always have, because we knew that being on the move was almost impossible to film as a proposition. But less impossible walking than I think Brian's initial suggestion, which was that we would bike around Montreal, which it took us a while to dismiss, but not too long.
Yeah, unfortunately, this film happened just after I'd fallen off my bike and had a bit of my collarbone sort of poked out of my skin. So my shoulder wasn't up for doing particularly dangerous cycling photography.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think we can all be glad, of course, not least you, that you did stay on foot. And I like the idea of this Janus camera that kind of can look in two ways at once, and that in a way leads us to our next question, which strangely, Hugo, comes from your brother Paul. Now, obviously, this is something that you can talk about afterwards. It's a great question. Many thanks, Paul, for this. But I think this is one for you, Hugo. Given what you just said, looking and being seemed integral to the film, being with, I should say. In Lingis's thoughts about the gaze and the touch, but also in the fish who coughed and spooked them, and the bird's eyes. Is this calculated?
Well, no. This sort of comes in the realms of what I'd say. Hello, Paul, by the way. In the realms of lucky finds, you know, which is also something that's informed my work forever. I've always felt that if I can imagine it, it's probably not that interesting. And I'd like to put myself in places where things will happen that I could neither have made happen or could have expected to happen. So, for example, I mean, a degree of awareness of what's interesting, of course, is useful. But when the cockatoo Zoltan lands on my shoulder, I knew that was a little gift from the bird. And the fact that it stayed there and eyeballed me in a slightly terrifying way, you know, with me not entirely sure it wasn't going to rip my ear off. These are beautiful moments that, of course, you can't choreograph, but once you've heard the conversation, you know you've been given something very important. And this kind of coincidence, giving yourself, putting yourself in a place where those kinds of coincidences can happen and you know what's valuable, is precisely what I do.
Yeah, tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm going to bring in the third clip now, if I could, so that we can look at a trace of every film in the series. So let's have a look at the third clip now, and we'll speak about it afterwards. Thank you very much.
I like very much light, and I can spend a long time in the sun, only for thinking. Because thinking under the sun, when you feel the star, it's very good for thinking. 20 years ago appeared this particular writing based on computers, on logic and symbolic machines, producing writing in a new way, which is an industrial way, at the speed of light, and based on softwares. This produced a change, an organological change in the organization of capitalism. We must make what I call an organological analysis of the effects of writing. With writing, you can transform the organization of your brain. And the 20th century was destroying the critical circuits, the transformation of the eyes, for example, could produce a new stage of the individuation of this organ that is an eye, which is never only an eye, because the organ that the view is, and not only the eye, is produced, for example, by the museum, the churches, the buildings, the monuments.
Welcome back. Thank you very much indeed for that. That was a clip from the film that Adrian and Hugo, my wonderful guests this evening, have made with Bernard Stiegler. More on that in a minute. More on that in a minute, and we're bringing in other content for you in a multi-layered way, I think suitable to the nature of the philosophical enterprise, always having to deal with more than one idea at once, breaking out of the binary situation. So that's just to keep everyone on their toes. Do remember the hashtag currently is stay alert. Of course, no longer stay at home for reasons that we all know. So many thanks indeed for that. And we're now going to think, Adrian, if we could, about questions that I think can be prompted also partly by the Stiegler clip we've seen, because they are about houses, and Stiegler clearly has an appealing house, slightly different, of course, from Al Lingis's. But question from Adam Huffman. Many thanks, Adam, for that. You've been with us before. Thanks for coming back. Adam asks, when I see houses like Al Lingis's, they seem supremely finished. Was there a sense during the visit that it was dynamic and evolving still, that if they visited 5 years later, or perhaps now, if they could, it might be completely different? Would new artifacts just accumulate, ignoring, of course, whichever changes the birds themselves might enact? And let's hold that house question, if we could, and bring in Georgina's question. Many thanks, Georgina, for this. Adrian, if you could start with this, and then we'll move to Hugo as well. Would you both consider Al Lingis's very open curiosity as fed primarily by his travels, or led by his thought, if you like, a nice kind of catch-22 there, which prompts him into the world? So how do you bring those two questions together, Adrian? The house and the nature of thought.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe I can answer the last one first, because I think it would be impossible to separate the two with Al. I mean, clearly, the thinking is a practice of movement in any case, and it's a movement of thought. And but it's also something that he's taking on the road with him in a particular way, and learning from specific relations and specific encounters. So the two are really intimately woven into each other, and perhaps that also leads to this sense in which the house is an unfinished place. I mean, actually, literally, it was in any case. I think at the moment we arrived, there had been some flooding, and there was some plasterboard. Maybe you see it at some point in the film, and some renovations are in motion. But the house is a kind of dwelling place for Al, and in that sense I think it's unfinished as well, in the sense that he's like any kind of archivist and collector and accumulator of things. He's always having to make new spaces to house the things that he's invested in. Actually, when I spoke to him last, we had an exchange on email, in fact, over the new year, and he mentioned to me that he had now acquired some homing pigeons. And I think, in a way, that seems almost perfect as well, as they're birds that do the traveling, but always return to the place from which they come. So, I think he's it's a constant movement in Al's practice of going outside to come back to some consolidated or crystallized thought about the nature of the outside.
Tremendous. Thank you very, very much indeed. I mean, Hugo, following on from that and bringing in our next question, I mean, the nature of the kind of unfinished house, of course, is a pleasure to the filmmaker. And you described earlier on how you obviously don't want to tidy things up. And that tidying, or the desire not to tidy, rather, is in the question from Christine. Many thanks, Christine, for your question. And many thanks indeed for asking one, because you are, of course, one of our guests next week. More on that very shortly, but a brilliant baton relay in the interrogative mode. So thank you very much for that. You say that you loved the resistance in the edit to tidying things up, to removing the pauses. So a nice parallel there with the domestic space. Was that revealed in the editing process, and was it a conscious decision then made to keep that sense of thinking in the real-time present? So I think for you there, a question, Hugo, between the space, the rich space of thought and the dynamic nature of the collection, and then the nature of how that transferred into the edit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, what Christine says is totally right. It's almost a statement, and I wouldn't disagree with any of it. And we do absolutely keep pauses in for that space to see the thinking. I mean, I would also say that we're leaving that for the audience to think in as well, because, you know, for example, there's quite an elaborate focus pull that goes while Al is watching Ron Athey, and the focus pull goes from Al to the wall of butterflies to the sculpture on the wall, and then back to Al, and then down to Ron. And it's a ridiculously elaborate move, and I don't know what made me do it at the time, but I figured that if we've got Al thinking for that long, we can probably get our audience thinking too in that space. And so that was absolutely a response to longueur, if you like. And just on the house and the way that the house was changing, yes, it was being worked on. And the last shot, one of the very last shots in the film, is Al sitting on the telephone. It almost looks like a still. He's so still. But he's actually trying to arrange a new carpet. And and extraordinarily, and I mean, I was listening to some of that conversation. I actually walked out of the room, leaving the camera running, so I only heard some of the conversation later. But extraordinarily, there's a whole conversation. There's part of the dialogue is about what is in the carpet, and how he had he'd recently been looking at a book where all the bugs were blown up massive, a kind of micro ecologies of the carpet. And so clearly he was going to be changing those particular animals in his house for a new set of animals, or, you know, giving a new habitat. So yes, constantly changing, I would say.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we've just got two more questions now, which I think in a way, one for each of you. They're nice. Georgina following up. Thank you very much indeed, Georgina. You enjoyed the phrase that Adrian coined, the idea of a kind of distant intimacy. And so in that sense, would you say that Al Lingis is an intense presence, a catalyzing one? I mean, that's slightly different, of course, from being a thinking presence, but for you, Adrian, he's obviously a catalyzing presence in the world and on the page.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think catalyzing in a very real sense, you know, that actually, for instance, this method that arose in the film as a method of exchange became something for me that I then wanted to investigate further, and so I started to use it as a dialogic method in public exchanges with artists. So I started to create this series called Archive Drafts, in which the rule was that you would know that you would be in relation with a specific artist. You would not discuss the content of your conversation in advance, but that you would bring each other these archival gifts that you would literally exchange in the event of the dialogue, and speak with and to them why you were giving a particular gift to someone. And so it became, actually, it generated a whole form of exchange, which is, you know, was somehow set in motion by Al, catalyzed by Al in the film. And also following the film, we wrote together a piece where we started to interlace our writing, and again did that as a performance lecture, and Hugo very kindly accompanied us and shot that for us as well. So these encounters generate other encounters, and they become a kind of ongoing series of relations that get reinflected through different relations in other worlds. And that's I think precisely what's happening also when people read Al's exquisite writing. I should just say also that for those people really interested in pursuing Al's work, I picked up a few weeks back the latest book of his, which is called Irrevocable Philosophy of Mortality. And you'll actually see, if you read the book, that I think a lot of the writing that is here in the book was moving through Al in its initial stages in the film. I hadn't realized this, but there are whole stories and anecdotes and analects that are now published in this text that were kind of imminent in our exchanges and weren't particularly formulated. So there's a whole section on the weight of things and the weight of the world, and some extraordinary stories that we couldn't put in the film, either because we weren't filming when we heard them, or because we couldn't make them work with the other material compositionally. So it's really beautiful to see also how the dialogue has another life in another work, a much more elaborate and discursive and articulate work.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That's tremendous. I mean, I think the idea of the onward creative collaboration, between you and the philosophers, both of you, of course, and between the two of you, is really striking and heartening. It's a cross-disciplinary collaboration, and it's one that, of course, is shaped by your own life experiences and the way that things move in the world, which I think is the best way to be. Now we're moving to the last moment, sadly, of the conversation. But a question for you, Hugo, I think, in a way, thinking about the form that we've been talking about, in a way throughout the last hour of the works. They seem to be very striking works that bring in elements of choreography, of performance, as we mentioned. There's a form of dialogue, there's a form of improvisation. And that's the question that Jill has, that aspect of the improvisatory. Do you think of filming now, particularly coming out of this series, as an improvisation? I mean, given the invented cameras and the lack of tidying, the coincidental, is it a form of performance for you in that regard?
Absolutely. I mean, filmmaking. I mean, I can say that I've just spent over a year making a film which is almost entirely improvised. It's a film called Second Self: Beethoven Resurrection. And it's a kind of magical realist documentary where Beethoven is reborn in London on Brexit night, or multiple Brexit nights. And he walks through London trying to get the money that was owed to him by the Royal Philharmonic Society. Now that film, it's a kind of fiction, of course, but it's entire. There was no script. We had a journey, essentially. We mapped a journey which was quite closely thought through in terms of what might happen in various places. And we staged interventions with artists along the way where he would meet people, but we didn't tell those artists, whether they were choreographers, singers, dancers, whatever, what they were to do with him. And neither did we really tell Jerry Killick, who was improvising the Beethoven character, what he should do. So on these nights, which are framed by real events in the world, which are kind of riotous, for example, one Brexit night, of course, was Halloween. So there was a mixture of Brexit horror and other horror. And then there was the real Brexit night, which was just one kind of horror. And, against this backdrop, a sort of journey happens and a character is formed, or a series of events and thoughts are visualized, and that was an amazing experience. We're still editing. We haven't finished making it, but we finished shooting it. So this improvisational approach to even making quite intellectually structured works, I think, is absolutely where I'm going and will continue to go.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we are moving sadly to the close of the event this evening. There is a lot more work from both Hugo and Adrian together and discreetly that you can find. Please do visit their eponymous named websites where you will find full and extensive documentation of obviously their shared projects and independent activities over many, many decades now. They're really great resources, and on Adrian's site you will find transcriptions of all the films that we've seen clips from, and of course the full transcription as well of Transfigured Night with Alphonso Lingis. There is much more that we could talk about here, which we sadly don't have time for. These are really just dips in the water, particularly in the case of tonight's conversation, for huge bodies of work that really are formed here, I think, in a series without precedent. They're not documentaries in a limited and reductive sense. They are not exclusively performances. They are not exclusively dialogues. They're ways of being in the world with active thought. And I think it's a really, really important and significant series. You will, like I've said, find all the details online, and you can view all the films online as well and buy DVDs if that is your mode of encounter, which I hope it might be, because they are wonderful packages in their own right as well. These have been close encounters with expansive minds, little glimpses into whole worlds of being in action. So many, many thanks indeed to Hugo and Adrian for that. There is much more work that they are making together. Please do go to the website and find out what that is. We're going to close very shortly with a trailer for next week's film, which I do hope you will stay for. But just to remind you of that subscription offer that I mentioned tantalizingly halfway through the conversation, where in a unique endeavor as part of the Screen at Home initiative, the LRB are offering, and you can take this in whichever way you arithmetically see fit, to whichever way it will seem even more generous to you than it already is. 12 issues will be given to you for £12. That's obviously an issue over 12 issues over half a year, which is £1 per issue. Now that's pretty good to me, it seems, and certainly the density and the quality of thought in the LRB arguably would reach to the bar raised by Adrian and Hugo and their wonderful protagonists in this series of films that we've been enjoying tonight. Please do go to lrb.me/screen and you will find the full details there. Many thanks to everyone at the LRB and the LRB Bookshop for making this screening series possible. Many thanks to you for joining. I'd like to extend particular thanks for this session to Emma Leach. Many thanks for all your help, Emma. And with Adrian and myself in mind, for reasons that we can't go into here, to John Marshall in Exeter, I would absolutely not be sitting here. And many of you would be perhaps glad that if that had been the case. But I would not be sitting here without John Marshall's wonderful support over the years. Many thanks indeed for all you've done, John. That's pretty much it for now, I think. Like I said, do please follow up in all the usual ways that we would encourage you to do. Think about these wonderful thinkers that we've been privileged to encounter through Adrian and Hugo's work. And I'm now going to thank them both very much indeed. And we're going to leave you now with the trailer for the next week's film, which of course proceeds in the usual way. You will get a newsletter if you're signed up to the LRB Bookshop newsletter. You will get a newsletter tomorrow with a link to the film and full details about the wonderful essay film Further Beyond, made by Christine Malloy and Joe Lawler. They will be in conversation, again, another wonderful creative duo, with me next week at 7 p.m. British Summer Time, UK time. I do hope you can join us. Thank you very much for being with us. And now do please enjoy the trailer for Further Beyond.
And so we see Ambrose and his family pack up what belongings they have or can carry on their cart and begin the arduous trip eastwards across rugged country. The light is fading. Ambrose huddles in the corner of the horse-drawn cart and uses straw to keep himself warm. It starts to rain. Ambrose, dressed in rags, looks back at Loch Arrow. He doesn't know it yet, but this is the last time he will see this landscape. As they move slowly over the rough ground, he's thinking about British colonial rule. He's thinking what a drag this is. Ambrose looks at his parents' faces for clues. It's clear they're not happy. Not happy at all. Perhaps they too think this is something of an inconvenience. Perhaps they're thinking of Irish nationalism here, or maybe they're thinking of the injustice of it all. Perhaps what they're really thinking of is the humiliation. In the biopic, they will have a long journey in which to dwell upon this humiliation. A humiliation that Ambrose will learn much about in the coming years.